All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Good morning from Washington, D.C., everyone. My name is Nate Rafati. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's roundtable on what comes next, deal or war with Iran. If you've taken the time to register for a Zoom call, I think you'll be familiar with the context that has brought us here today. In about 48 hours from now, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are expected to be in Geneva for negotiations with Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. These will be the third round of Omani-mediated talks between the two sides this month. The stakes could hardly be higher. In recent weeks, the U.S. has deployed two aircraft carrier groups, scores of fighter jets, and defensive systems across the Middle East. President Trump, who in January warned of U.S. intervention as the Iranian regime cracked down against major nationwide unrest, has warned that the Islamic Republic could face really bad things if it rejects a deal and is reportedly considering an array of strike options that could be limited but also broad and occur imminently, soon, or not at all. Meanwhile, an Iranian government contending with discontent from below and economic turmoil faces the prospect of a second major attack in 8 months. And though it too expresses its interest in an agreement, it is also holding on to long-standing red lines on what it is and is not willing to negotiate. Its leadership has also threatened to turn any attack by the US or its allies into a regional war. To get a sense of where we are and how we got here and where things might go, I'm pleased to welcome our three distinguished panelists today. Ali Vaez is joining us from Geneva. He is the Crisis Group's Iran Project Director and has written widely on Iran's nuclear program, its regional policies, and its decision-making. From Tel Aviv, we're joined by Merav Zonshine. Merav joined Crisis Group in 2021 as the senior analyst for Israel-Palestine. She's also a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. And finally, pleased to welcome Nate Swanson, who's a resident senior fellow and director of the Iran Strategy Project at the Atlantic Council. Prior to joining the Atlantic Council, he spent nearly 20 years as a career State Department official, primarily focused on Iran, and also served as director for Iran at the National Security Council. Now, in terms of housekeeping, I'll start off with some questions to our panelists. If you are tuned in, you are welcome to submit your questions in the Q&A box with your name and affiliation. And finally, this call is being recorded and live streamed, so very much on the record. So with that out of the way, we can get started with some context. And Nate, if you allow me to start with you. When President Trump came back to office for a second term in January of last year, there was a fairly predictable emphasis on redoubling maximum pressure, the policy of economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation that was key in his Iran policy in the first term. But there was also a second, perhaps less anticipated effort at diplomacy. He wrote to Iran's leadership saying, let's make a deal. And you were part of that negotiating team that was involved in 5 rounds of negotiations in April and May of last year under Special Envoy Witkoff. So to give us a sense of how we got here, can you give us your take on what those engagements were like and how the president approaches this file generally?
Well, sure. And thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. So I think you're right with your basic analysis, right? When I came back to the State Department to work on this, my assumption, like everyone else, was that we would be a heavy focus on maximum pressure and that this would be Trump 2 would be a lot like Trump 1. The most notable part of his maximum pressure campaign and his NSPM 2 that he signed right away was how reluctant he was to do it. He says, like, I don't want to sign this. I hope, we can make a deal. And then, and so he immediately even though he signed this in February, he immediately in March turned to like wanting diplomacy, right? Supreme leader, as you mentioned, right? And so I do think there was a genuine desire to get a deal as part of his legacy and I think, I think it was a serious endeavor. it was surface level and more atmospheric than substantive, but it was genuine. And so, as you mentioned, we went 5 rounds. Steve Witkoff leading it, and I think it was a genuine. But this is how we got here now. It's like this is a uniquely Trump enterprise where he can zig and zag very quickly, right? So where he was, I think, serious about a deal, Israel presented him with an equally big option of military strikes, and he ultimately decided to sign on to that. And and so, as we're sitting here now, it's sort of a shocking place to be. 6 weeks ago, Iran underwent these massive protests and massive crackdown, and he's made this completely unnecessary decision to make this a binary choice between either war or diplomacy. But that's exactly where we are, right? I mean, I think in pretty much any other administration, you would be thinking about this in the context of like Iran just made this mess. Let's let them clean up their own mess. But Trump didn't see it that way. He saw this as kind of a chance to do maximalist expectations, and so or thinking maximalist outcomes. And so, it's really become this zero sum idea of we'll either get a deal or we will go to war. And I think the two defining things that are really noteworthy about this is one is I think and this is really came through in the Steve Witkoff's interview with Fox News on Sunday, is he really expects, given the strength of our military presence, of Iran's, public weakness, their military weakness, he expects Iran to capitulate. He thinks he has all the leverage in this case. And I think that's probably, and all he can talk about this more, but a fundamental misreading of how Iran operates. And so I don't think that's the case. And I think the second aspect of this, and probably is the most dangerous, is I think he feels very confident that there'll be very minimal repercussions to a military strike. He has this track record of success of proving critics wrong. I mean, you could go even back to his first term. You can't move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. There's be massive unrest. It didn't happen. Can't strike Iran's nuclear program while they try to break out. Can't happen. Can't do the thing like you did with Maduro in Venezuela. And he's proven critics wrong time and time again. So I think he believes right now that okay, fine. Even if we can't get a deal, like I'll be fine in war. And that's just a very risky proposition. So that's kind of I think how he's viewing this.
Thanks. And just to dig into that point about, you said that it was more atmospherics than substance. I mean, after the war, Iran's foreign minister has written and said that we were actually quite close to a deal. That wasn't my impression, but from your sense, and obviously without giving away any, state secrets, were the discussions primarily limited to non-proliferation concerns? And how, would a sixth round that, was due to be held before the start of the war? So the Israelis launched Operation Rising Lion on Friday the 13th. There had been a sixth round of negotiations scheduled for that Sunday. Do you think that a sixth or a seventh round was the trajectory towards an actual agreement, or was it still kind of, we want enrichment, we want no enrichment, and kind of going around in circles on that aspect?
Uh, I don't think no. I mean, so the answer is to their first question is no, is we were never close to an agreement, despite what both the US and Iran said, right? I think the US was using this process to figure out what our position was, right? I mean, if you remember after round one, Arachi talked about, or sorry, Witkoff talked about, Iran, maybe even enriching at 20% level, right? Where then he shifted before round two to 3.67. And then there was significant uprising within the president's own base, and then it switched to no enrichment, right? And then you kind of waffled on that for rounds 4 and 5. So no, look, there was not going to be a breakthrough in round 6 or 7 because I think we still didn't have a clear, and I don't think Iran had a clear objective of what was a clear idea of what our objective was, and so no, it wasn't going to be an immediate breakthrough. And I think fundamentally, neither side really had asked each other the hard questions about what they really were willing to concede on. And so I'm not sure if we're there now either. I don't think it was a disingenuous process, and I don't think there's been all these theories that this was all set up to as a prelude to war. I don't think that's right. I just think it just didn't go very deep, and then Trump was very eager to make or willing to make a pivot when presented with another opportunity. I think we're basically in the same camp here.
Thanks. And Ali, let me turn to you. That pivot, took the form of an Israeli military strike. The U.S. eventually joined in after several days with Operation Midnight Hammer, taking out three of Iran's key enrichment facilities. For the Iranians, that all happened after months of setbacks for the axis of resistance, the weakening of Hezbollah, the weakening of Hamas, the loss of Bashar Assad in Syria. And then since the war, the regime's problems haven't really gotten any better. The economy continues to set record lows in terms of the Iranian rial. Inflation continues to be high. Beginning in December, they faced the latest round of major nationwide unrest, which is what prompted initially President Trump's warnings of intervention. So between the war and the protests, what is the Iranian system taken away from the war itself, and how do those protests fit into its calculus now as it comes back to these negotiations?
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you everyone for joining us. I continue to be amazed by the fact that people don't get tired of the subject. So it's great to see such a big audience today joining us, especially to benefit from the expertise of my colleagues on this panel. Look, the Iranians have a very different perception of what happened in the 12-day war. They believe that they didn't lose that war, they were not defeated, given the fact that it was not them who asked for a ceasefire, it was the US and Israel who asked for a ceasefire. For the Iranian leadership, survival is victory, and they did survive. Not only they did survive, they also managed to punch back in ways that they inflicted the kind of harm on Israel that we have not seen since the 1973 conflict. And so, from their perspective, yes, they were taken by surprise. Yes, there were serious setbacks and shortcomings in the system, but nevertheless, it was not, they were not defeated in the way that it was portrayed in Washington and in Jerusalem. And of course, since then, I think the policy was primarily on trying to repair and recover very quickly. And so they didn't want to do anything that would invite another strike, turn into a casus belli. This is why the nuclear program remained dormant in this period. They put the entire emphasis on rehabilitating their missile program. China provided significant amount of help, especially by sending chemical components that they need for solid fuel of their missiles. But nevertheless, the Iranians were careful not to cross the U.S. or Israel's red lines. I think the biggest mistake in this period was twofold. One was not to try to learn the diplomatic lessons of why is it that in the first 4 years of Trump's time in office in his first term and the first year of his second term, despite the fact that there were engagements, direct and indirect, mediated and not, that they never managed to figure out the art of diplomacy with Trump, which is quite different than any other US president that the Islamic Republic has experienced. And then the second mistake is that that very brief moment of a sense of nationalism that was resurgent in Iran in the aftermath of the 12-day war could have turned into a moment of national reconciliation as well, could have turned into a moment of the regime, instead of figuring out how it can either live to fight another day or negotiate with its enemy, to negotiate with its own people, to find accommodation and a modus vivendi with its own people. It basically took the support for granted, engaged in some superficial exploiting of nationalism, but then went back to its old playbook. And that is the result. That is why we saw protests and the explosion on the streets in December, January, that ended in a bloody massacre. But there's also one other lesson that I think the Iranians have learned, not just from the 12-day war, but from all the experiences that they have had with Trump, including and starting with Soleimani's killing in 2020. The conclusion is that every time they respond to Trump's provocations or aggression with restraint or calibrated escalation, it only invites more aggression. And this sense that is prevailing in Washington and Jerusalem, that Iran is ready to fall or to fold, has to change into Iran is ready to fight. And this is why, the only way to basically puncture this sense of this aura of invincibility that Nate was talking about, that the president has, especially in the aftermath of the operation to remove Maduro, it is something that the Iranians believe would have to be punctured by drawing blood, by imposing a cost. That's the only language that President Trump understands. And there's, of course, empirical evidence for it. Last year, in the confrontation with the Houthis, as soon as the cost started accumulating, we know in a matter of a month, the cost was about $1 billion. The Houthis nearly managed to sink a U.S. warship, and the president backed out of that confrontation. Going further back in history, his role model, Ronald Reagan, in the aftermath of the killing of 241 U.S. Marines in Beirut, left the region. He didn't double down. So based on these experiences, their own experiences with the Trump administration, I think this is a regime that is no longer just homicidal towards its own people, but because it's cornered and because its options are narrowing, it is increasingly becoming suicidal.
Well, that's cheery. Thank you, Ali. Meirav, let me turn to you. And as a reminder to our viewers, you're welcome to submit questions through the Q&A box. We've already got a couple of good ones that we'll come back to in a bit. Meirav, Ali referred to the Iranian takeaway from the June war with a fairly minimal level of success, which is that they didn't lose. In Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a speech at the end of the war and was very, very bullish about Israel's achievements on what he's framed as the two existential threats that Iran was posing prior to the start of the war. One was a nuclear program that was spinning at 60% enrichment, had cut down inspections, et cetera, et cetera. And the other one was a ballistic missile program that the Israelis say was ramping up significantly by the time the war had started. And that the prime minister and other Israeli officials were saying that this achievement was massive, building on Israel's other post-October 7th achievements in Lebanon and in Syria and elsewhere. At the same time, just as these protests were getting started in the end of December, Prime Minister Netanyahu was also at Mar-a-Lago, and by many reports raising concerns over the rehabilitation of Iran's ballistic missile program and a bit of concern about the nuclear program. So what's your sense of that balance between achievement and unfinished business, generally in this post-October 7th wars, but in particular as it relates to Iran and Rising Lion?
Thanks, Nason, and it's good to be with all of you. I mean, as you said, the post-June war victory narrative in Israel was very, very strong, and it was across the board, the political spectrum, even those who hate Netanyahu from the right, the center, the left, they all were very unanimously clear that this was a big success. And I'll just caveat and say that in whatever I'll say has to do with things that I'm hearing from security and defense officials, and I try to separate that from the politics, from the domestic politics, and from Netanyahu's, desire and determination to remain in power. But those things can't actually be completely separated because they're always overlapping. So I'll try to take that into account as I go. But essentially, Israel, since October 7th, has changed its strategy from one of we're not going to rely on deterrence, we're not going to rely on people's intentions. Certainly, Israel hasn't really been interested in a deal with Iran, or really with deals to close out its other fronts with Lebanon and others, even though they're sort of in a process. And it bases its strategy on capabilities. If there are capabilities, then we will have freedom of action to take them down. And that's not just Netanyahu, that's all of the security and defense establishment. That's the lesson from October 7th, and that guides a lot of what goes on here. But, the success of October 7th, the success of the response to October 7th, and certainly the June war is two main things. One is that, as we see, there's been no enrichment. There's been zero enrichment since June, and that is, I think, a big basis for why a deal could be achieved on the nuclear program now. And that's a huge achievement. And I'll get into this maybe a little bit later, but I mean, Israel has moved the needle and the goalposts to the ballistic missile issue. But a few months ago, or certainly a few years ago, if we looked at where we are today on the potential, and as Ali was saying, that Iran might be able to concede on certain things that would have been unheard of, that's a big success. That's a big achievement. And the other one is the US involvement, the fact that the US joined and struck Iran's nuclear facilities. That for Netanyahu is a dream, and that is a huge achievement for Israel's military establishment in general, something that it prepared for. And I think also because of all of the things that happened since October 7th, the weakening of Hezbollah and the fall of Assad, it created a window of opportunity that was very, very hard to not take advantage of. Whether or not we're in a better or worse position is arguable, but certainly I think Israel sees it as a huge success. That being said, Israeli officials that I speak to, but also the wider Israeli public to some extent, despite the fact that there seems to be a sense that there was a huge success, there's also a lot that's left, that's left hanging. I mean, we don't have really agreements on any of the fronts, and Israel doesn't really seem to be interested in any kind of deal with Iran. The deal that it would want is unrealistic in the similar way that it wants Hamas and Gaza to be completely demilitarized, which is unrealistic. But the downside of Israel's success is that it also exposed the ballistic missile threat, because as Ali mentioned, and I was here, at least for part of it, because I was stuck in Paris when it happened and came back through Egypt, but it was hell. It was hell being here. And the last almost 2 months now of a threat of Trump, I mean, we talk, the geopolitical and the strategy, but on a basic human level, being here in Israel is terrifying. The fear and anxiety and the unknown and the uncertainty for weeks now of whether this is going to start is horrific. And so Israelis do feel that and take that into account. And certainly professionals who think about the cost benefit analysis, considering the success in June, have to think, what are we going to be able to achieve again that we didn't achieve in June? That's not going to bring us back to the same kind of mowing the grass, mowing the lawn pattern, which Israel can do in Lebanon and Gaza, but certainly cannot do in Iran. And people understand that. So, the downside is that it kind of unleashed this threat of the ballistic missiles that Iran understands is the underbelly, I think, of Israel's very, very solid defense. And also the fact that Israel was and is dependent on the US and on other regional allies for its defense, for its ability to kind of keep up in any kind of campaign with Iran. So, there are, in any war, in any campaign, there are successes, but there are also weaknesses and things that come out. And so I think that's something that Israeli officials are dealing with. And I think lastly, I'll say that I think, in June, we heard from the national security advisor at the time that we're not looking to have regime change in Iran, but that would be a nice byproduct. I don't know if I buy that. And I think that, many of us on this panel would agree that Israel has been wanting the regime to change and to fall for a long time. But I've heard from Israeli officials that say, as successful as June was, it didn't change the regime calculus. Now, does Israel really think it's able to change this regime's calculus? I doubt it. So I take those kinds of comments with a grain of salt. But the point is that if Israel is trying to change the regime's behavior, but at the same time understands that that's kind of impossible, then its ultimate goal is to bring down the regime. And at the same time, I think Israel understands very clearly, and that might be part of what it was saying to Trump when he first threatened to strike, is not just that it doesn't have enough defense, but that it doesn't really understand what would come in its stead. What would regime change and collapse look like? And what would it mean to have, an enriched material and weapons in a vacuum and in chaos in a huge country with no clear leadership? So I think as much as we think that Israel is very much in favor of war and in favor of regime change, we should also keep in mind that I think they understand that there would be a lot of risk and chaos involved, certainly in a protracted campaign in which it would probably be the primary victim, but also the fact that we're not sure where it would go. And so that's something to keep in mind.
Thank you, Meirav. So that all tees us up for what we expect to be the focus of conversations in Geneva the day after tomorrow. There are a lot of ways in which Iran-US diplomacy is exceptional to the way that diplomacy is usually conducted, but even comparing the negotiations between the Trump administration and the Iranians, both the ones that Nate was involved in and the ones that have been going on right now, there are even more complicating factors. The fact that these are conducted indirectly for the most part, and I'm sure Nate in particular bears the scars of, weeks on end in a hotel in Vienna litigating over semicolons and commas, to where we are right now, where it's a 3-hour session and both sides return to capital, and in the meantime pick up the phone to the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Omanis, the Egyptians, the IAEA. There are a lot of things about this process that are quite peculiar, but to stick to the diplomatic prospects for the moment, Ali, you said that the Iranians had not heeded the lessons from Trump's first term on the art of diplomacy with this administration. Is your sense now that, certainly, pression sharpens the mind, given what they've been through with the pre-war negotiations, the war itself, and everything else that's on the table now, in terms of substance, is your sense that the Iranians are intending to come back to Geneva with something a little bit different? And how much does it move the needle from what Nate was talking about in the pre-war rounds, where they were actually not that close at all?
That's an interesting question, Nason, and it's actually when you think about the process, it's just so different than everything we were used to in the past. And Nate can correct me, but I rarely recall since 2013 negotiations, all the way when it became serious, all the way to JCPOA revival negotiations. And last year, it's very rare for the Iranians to initiate ideas. They often prefer to react to other people putting ideas on the table. So to ask them to draft ideas is quite a change. But I think one element that they have not figured out about President Trump is just a man. The uniqueness about the character, his impulsiveness, his desire for personal glorification, his transactional, the nature of his transactionalism. And this is why their style is still very much JCPOA type of negotiations, is less spectacle, more substance, more technical details that the president doesn't really care about. So this is one of the major shortcomings on the Iranian side. Having said this, there are things that have changed compared to even negotiations last year or negotiations under Obama. But up until last year, Iran had an industrial scale enrichment program, whereas in the past 8 months, it has not spun a single centrifuge. It has not enriched a single gram of uranium. So some of the things that the US has wanted for a very long time and the Iranians were reluctant to put on the table, including zero enrichment, is fact on the ground. It's already sunk cost. Now, accepting and acknowledging reality is one thing. Foregoing rights that are enshrined in the NPT is another thing. I'm not suggesting that the Iranians would ever forego the right to a nuclear fuel cycle. But would they be willing to potentially continue the suspension of enrichment, which they have done in the past 8 months, for a period of time before they get to a stage that they would have either a miniaturized token enrichment program or an enrichment program that is no longer sovereign in the sense that it is wrapped into some sort of a consortium, which is in essence kicking the can down the road? Yeah, I think that those kind of solutions are now available, and they were not in the past. There are still very difficult technical issues that would have to be dealt with. And I just use the example of the 60% enriched uranium stockpile as an example. Now, you have to go dig out this material. There are some unexploded ordinances in that area. So it's not an easy thing to do. You have to have inspectors present. And as soon as access is available, inspectors would have to go in and do accountancy. If any of these cylinders in which the material was kept is damaged and the material is dispersed, or they can't find all the 440 kilogram of 60%, they find, let's say, 400. You have a major proliferation crisis. I mean, let's remember that all the problems Iran had with the IAEA in all these years about safeguards were related to a few grams of unenriched uranium dating back from 20 years ago. So, this is very hard to do. But once the material is accounted for, then it has to be diluted or shipped out. It would have to be done in installments, and each installment would have to be matched with sanctions relief, which from the Iranian perspective would have to be irreversible because they're giving away something they can't regain in the short run. And so sanctions relief would also have to be irreversible. So you see how difficult this is to negotiate these details, even if the parties can overcome some of the main obstacles in these talks. That requires patience, discipline, expertise, and a lot of that is absent, especially on the US's side.
And Ali, let me follow up on that because, and then I'll throw the question in a different way to Nate. Everything you're describing right now is on the nuclear, which anyone who's worked on this file knows is complex enough. I think it was interesting that Director General Grossi, the head of the IAEA, was in Geneva for the second round of negotiations. I think he's been in touch with the Iranians and the Americans since, and I saw initial reports that he also may be back in Geneva on Thursday. So that again suggests that the IAEA is actively engaged in what would be some of the non-proliferation and verification elements in a potential deal. So that's quite interesting. But we are still only talking about nuclear. And the US has at various points raised anywhere between 1 and 5 issues that they want on the table. So nuclear, as you laid out, is actually 2 different elements, right? There's the accountancy on the fissile material that they have, and then there's the future trajectory of the program. But then we've had US officials refer to missiles. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's referenced in terms of range. Sometimes it's referenced in terms of inventory. President Trump, I think on one occasion said no missiles. So that's the second major bucket of issues. The third bucket is Iran's relationship with its proxies, this network of non-state allies and partners that it has across the region. And Secretary Rubio and I think UN Ambassador Waltz have also referred to domestic conditions, Iran's repression of its own people. Do you see any room for the Iranians to go, even if we can find a Venn diagram where there's sufficient overlap on nuclear, where the Iranians would put more on the table that goes beyond nuclear parameters? And then to Nate, I'll come back and try to get a sense of how many of those conditions are actually necessary versus essential versus optional.
Sure. So look, I think these talks will primarily succeed or fail on the question on the nuclear question, but that doesn't mean that you can't have non-nuclear issues involved. However, while it gets to while the nuclear issue would have to be substantive, just because of the technical detail of the problem at hand, the non-nuclear issues could be more symbolic or superficial at this stage, providing both sides with sufficient leeway to be able to declare victory, and also to check the box of addressing other concerns. And then maybe down the road, if things move in a good direction, those could also be addressed in a much more substantive way. So we at Crisis Group just published a statement providing ideas for some of these challenges. On the missile program, look, in the past, the Iranians had voluntarily put in place a limit on the range, 2,000 kilometers. Well, they can codify that. It's not giving away anything. They don't have an intercontinental ballistic missile at this point. But it would be a good way for President Trump to be able to say that he has diminished the threat of Iranian missiles ever reaching U.S. soil. So that's not nothing. And I, if I were in the shoes of the Iranians, I would do this as a unilateral concession because it's means of making whatever they achieve on the nuclear side more sustainable. On regional issues, there are two buckets of solutions, I think. One is some sort of a non-aggression understanding between Iran and the United States, which could implicitly apply to their allies in the region. This obviously is very hard to verify, even harder to enforce, but it would set the right tone for de-escalation. The Iranians could interpret that as the U.S. providing a security guarantee and potentially not giving a green light to Israel taking additional military action against them. President Trump can portray that as Iran providing a security guarantee for Israel and promising no longer to support its regional proxies. Again, I understand that it's not going to be something as substantive as what you can achieve on the nuclear front. But at this stage, I think it would stabilize the situation and bring down the temperature until there is room for more progress. Another possibility for addressing regional issues that I think would be very valuable to do is to try to create a parallel regional process in which Iran and its neighbors can engage in negotiations about arms control, about non-state actors, about other destabilizing events in the region and beyond. And that kind of security dialogue will be beneficial to everyone. It would bring about the kind of engagement that we have not seen in the region. So there are solutions if neither side is seeking maximalist demands.
Thank you, Ali. And I think it was interesting that before the two sides actually came back to Muscat earlier this month, there was originally talk of a meeting in Turkey where senior Gulf officials at foreign minister level would have joined as well. So that possibility at least has been mooted and could be a complement to all of this. But I think it also comes down to what the U.S. is actually trying to achieve here. And Nate, I will bring it to you to try to unpack that question. Is the president looking for a nuclear deal? Is he looking for a all-inclusive agreement? Is he looking for capitulation, or is he looking for regime change?
All of it. Look, I mean, an acceptable deal to the United States is whatever Donald Trump deems is appropriate, right? So I think it could be any of those options you laid out. It could be something, JCPOA minus to capitulation. I think they all are. And what is unique about Trump is that he likes being lobbied, right? So he's got people coming in saying, kind of closer to lines of what you said, closer to capitulation, all including, domestic and all these things. And so he's got that on one camp, and then I think he also probably gets some others who are just let's go small, let's take a victory, you can sell it. And so I think, and there's a world in where that works. And I think, what Trump really excels at is selling whatever he goes with. So I think it depends. What I see right now, though, is some mistakes being made on Iran's part that actually makes this more difficult, right? So you brought up Istanbul, which is I'm glad you did, because I think this was actually a really symbolic or really important development, because I think this was, a new format. Regional foreign ministers go to Istanbul, they talk with you have this summit. It's new, it's different, it looks different than the JCPOA. And it probably would lead to nothing substantive, but then President could point and say, "Look, I brought these people together. Everything's on the table. This is like historic." And the reality is, it's symbolic, but he could probably have sold that. And so I saw this as this golden ticket out of this mess for Iran, but they couldn't do it. Right? They couldn't meet in that format. They couldn't. They objected to location. They objected to even this broad discussion. And I think in some ways it shows like how perceptions are just as important to Khamenei as they are to Trump. Neither is willing to let the other save face. And so that in some ways I feel like that it just makes this really incredibly hard. And then the second thing I think that really makes it, well, actually two more things I think that really make it unlikely for diplomatic agreement. The second is, I've always kind of alluded to this. They're speaking completely different languages, right? I mean, look at the teams that showed up in Geneva last week, right? It was Arachi, his deputy, Ravanchi, his legal advisor, his spokesman, a team of technical experts focused on nuclear, team of technical experts focused on sanctions relief. And the U.S. shows up with Witkoff and Kushner. And I'm not saying one approach is better than the other, but it's just entirely different. And Iran hasn't been able to adjust to this new way that Trump wants to negotiate. And so, unless they're able to make that shift, and Ollie laid out ways that maybe they could and maybe it would work, they're just going to continue talking past each other, in my view. And then I guess the last thing that I think it's important to say is, I was yesterday. I was just driving in this DC blizzard of a half inch, and on NPR you have the I can't even remember exactly what said, but the Israelis saying the U.S. has told us that even if they get a nuclear deal with Iran, we have the green light to continue to strike Israeli missile sites. I mean, that has to go into the Iranian calculus for how they think of negotiations on this, right? I mean, if the U.S. is willing to make a deal on nuclear program, but Iran is still being attacked, that I think really limits the flexibility on either side. So sorry, that kind of was outside the question there, but I think all these factors combine to making a deal unlikely unless the president just decides he wants it, no matter what the details are.
And we'll come back to the alternative of a deal in a second. But Meirav, if Istanbul had happened, or if Istanbul format is revived, Israel will not, in all likelihood, be at the same table as the Iranians. But you've been speaking to Israeli officials, and I think one of the lines that I remember you sharing with us was the Israelis have a 3-no approach, right? No rehabilitation of nuclear, no rehabilitation of missiles, no rehabilitation of proxies. And we've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu come to the U.S. just in the past few days and share his concerns with the administration over any kind of deal. The Iranians will lie, they will cheat, you have them in a moment of weakness, etc. Is there a deal that, so let's say that the stated position are those 3 no's: no enrichment, no proxies, no missiles. Do you think that there is an agreement that, at least in private, the Israelis would be able to live with if the U.S. was able to reach it with the Iranians?
Well, first I'll say that Israel won't really have a choice. If Trump decides to go for a deal that's just nuclear, and whatever that deal looks like, and he's going to sell it as a better than Obama and better deal, what can Israel do? Certainly in the short term, and certainly publicly, you can't do anything about it. So I think a lot of this has to do with the understanding of the Israel-U.S. dynamic, and there is daylight between the U.S. and Israel. I mean, I think the main thing here to understand is that Netanyahu, specifically, and Israel more generally, have moved the needle outside of the nuclear agreement. Obviously, ballistic missiles pose a threat to Israel, but as one official told me recently, Israel lived for many years with Iran having ballistic missiles, and it wasn't considered an urgent threat. It's not to say that I don't think that Israel in the future will always say that it has freedom of action, and it will always want to use that action if and when it deems necessary. And that's something that Trump might have to deal with if he wants, as Nate was saying, to have a genuine deal, and Iran has to feel like it has something to gain and not just what to lose. But just to keep, again, the needle has moved and Israel has exposed the ballistic missile threat since June in a lot of ways. And as you said, the three no's, I think, except for enrichment, they're all being, the red lines have been crossed. I've also heard from Israeli officials that they said that Israel won't go to war with Iran over ballistic missile buildup. It has to be something else. And in the current formula, you have the US leading. I mean, Trump put us in this place. Yes, Netanyahu was talking about the ballistic missile issue before the unrest in Iran. Yes, he wanted to get Trump to say ballistic missiles are their own threat, and he got that as well. But I don't necessarily think that means that Trump is going to put the missiles in a deal and that that's a realistic thing. As I was saying before, Israel sets a bar that's very, very high. It's largely unrealistic, maybe because it wants the US to strike Iran, but maybe because it actually would be fine with having a very solid nuclear agreement that would put off Iran at least for the next 3 years of the Trump administration, but ideally longer. So, what Israel will live with is, dependent both on how firm Trump and his people are going to be on the type of realistic deal that is in American interests, the alternative of the risk of war, of course. And so Israel and Netanyahu won't be happy with just a nuclear deal. He wants a lot more than that. He said very clearly he wants, a missile range of up to 300 km. He wants, like a Libyan model of no nuclear infrastructure whatsoever. I don't think he's going to get that. So could Israel live with zero enrichment codified and some of the other things that Ali mentioned? Yes, I think it could. And there are sober heads in Israel who will say to you that this is the best time to reach a deal with Iran. When it's at its weakest, you try to get as many concessions as possible, maybe even string them along longer if possible. On the other hand, the material that the US put in the region, I don't know how much longer we can go like this, but the rhetoric that we hear from Israel, I think, is different from what Israel could actually live with and what would be in its interest. And it's certainly, I think, my analysis, our analysis as crisis group, is that it's not going to get more out of some kind of military campaign. That, as Ali was saying, Iran isn't just going to suddenly capitulate because of military force. And I think in general, the limits of military force in the post-October 7th situation, certainly with Iran, as much as Israel can achieve and the US with military force, there's a limit. At some point, you have to translate that into something else. So, again, like there's very, very wild rhetoric, but at the end of the day, the ballistic missile issue isn't necessarily an issue that needs to be in a deal. It's something that maybe can be gradually dealt with later on. It's something that Israel can down the line deal with in maybe more covert ways. There's plenty of ways in which it can be done. And so Israel putting the ballistic missile issue specifically on the table right now, I think it's just a way to move the needle, to set the bar very high. And then ultimately, I think just like Trump, Netanyahu can also ultimately say, oh, we got a deal and, this is a great deal. And it's because of our military action. And he can spin it as a victory as well. And Nysan, please feel free to embellish or add or refute.
No, thanks, Meirav. I think that's all fair. We've got some great questions coming in. Please send, I'm going to do one final round robin and then start to incorporate some of these questions as well. Nate, we started with, the buildup and we went several months after the war, after Midnight Hammer, with the nuclear program and the ballistic missile concerns kind of on the back burner, right? After the war, everyone just kind of went back to their respective corners. And it wasn't really until the start of the protests where it more forcefully came back on the US radar. President Trump, for the first time, said that The US wasn't going to just be satisfied with what it usually does in response to Iran protests, which is condemnation and sanctions, but actually intervene. I think the earliest statement was on January 2nd. And help is on the way, take over your institutions. This time last month, well, a little over a month ago in mid-January, it seemed like, and reporting has subsequently confirmed, that the US was very close to some form of military action. Since then, the focus has been less on the internal side of what's happening in Iran. The protests, there's still unrest on campuses, but in terms of a nationwide anti-government uprising, the system's iron fist has quelled that for the time being. And the US has brought in all of these assets to what end? There's reporting subsequently denied on a Truth Social post by President Trump yesterday about it being a limited potential action. Decapitation has been mooted as an option. Going after nuclear and missile sites has been mooted as an option. So if we get to Thursday or before Thursday or after Thursday in these meetings, show that there is no overlap that is going to satisfy the Trump administration and the Iranian government. And we move to some sort of military showdown. Where do you see that going? And I'll embellish that with a question from someone who has a lot of experience working on this file as well, Ambassador Rob McCare, who says, does the most likely outcome now look like limited US strikes billed as Iran, teaching Iran a lesson for repression and nuclear reconstruction, combined with more extensive regime change Israeli strikes? That way, Trump can evade some of the responsibility for any ensuing chaos. And after Nate, perhaps Meirav, we can bring you in as well on under what scenarios are we talking about U.S. strikes versus U.S. and or Israeli strikes?
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll be brief here. So look, I think again, like the previous question, I think ultimately it's like whatever Trump deems is appropriate will be the response. I do think, and this is just guess reading the news and reading Trump, is that it's shifted a little bit, right? I think originally there was this idea of doing something quick, symbolic, acting decisively, and moving on. And so I think that is how we started this process. But to all these points at the very beginning, right? I think we are now seeing Iran feels like they probably feel like they have to bloody Trump's nose, or like this will just continue inevitably and they will be attacked every so often. So I think that has raised the stakes of this whole encounter to the point where I think it is, and I think it could be much bloodier than originally anticipated. And I think it could challenge Trump's doctrine of decisive action, quick exit, right? And so I think that is part of the I think it's part of the reason you've seen hesitation, and I think it's also a big reason why you've seen the massive buildup, because I think it's to protect for those possibilities of Iran escalating the conflict and for going broader. So I think that is a big reason you've seen. But all that said is I still think the president is probably confident that he can pull off a quick exit, and I'm just not sure that's the case here.
Thanks. And Meirav, before I come to Ali on how Iran would deal with a military confrontation, do you think the Israelis expect to be a combatant? Would they wait and see to see if Iran retaliates against them, not just against the US? And I'll tack on another question for you as well, because one of the questions we've gotten through the chat is the rising tensions between Israel and Hezbollah. So is there a sense in Israel? So both on the dispatch end, do you see, under what scenarios do you see Israel becoming a combatant in this? And what is the concern level in Israel on the mobilization of Iranian-backed groups striking Israel, whether it's Hezbollah or perhaps the Houthis?
Thanks. So, I mean, obviously Israel would like, I think, to join in whatever the US is planning. And that, again, I think depends on what the US tells Israel. If the US tells Israel, we're going to do this and we want you to stay out of it. There are some in Israel who think that if the US strikes in a somewhat limited and calibrated capacity, maybe Iran will not retaliate against Israel, and it'll be something that's not escalatory. And so why would Israel, put itself if it doesn't have to? But I think largely the idea is that whatever happens, Iran will retaliate, and then Israel will have every legitimacy to go in. Similar dynamic with Hezbollah. They're just waiting for Hezbollah to do something, and then they go in much, much harder. But this is kind of the June war was Israel striking and the US joining, and supposedly, it wasn't clear if Trump would really do it in the end, and then he did. That set a precedent. It basically proved in Israeli eyes that Israel has the capabilities that Iran maybe didn't think it had, and that the US had the will, because we knew they had capability. And so Israel is sitting very pretty here with a situation in which, after the unrest, Trump is the one leading the show. Israel can take a step back, and actually in recent weeks, Israel has been relatively quiet on this issue. And so obviously Israel doesn't want to be seen as somebody that's, encouraging the US to go to war. I think Netanyahu himself has a lot at stake. It could go very well for him if it goes well and he goes to elections, that he could easily win on this, but it could also go very badly. And there's no way to know that. But I think Israel is probably preparing for various scenarios. It could be that the US and Israel decide together to split, US goes after certain targets. I would imagine that Trump would want to go after Khamenei, and take him out if he's doing something that's not just symbolic. Of course, I don't know, but I'm speculating. And, Israel has threatened to go after infrastructure and things that it didn't go after in June. Maybe oil facilities. People in the opposition in Israel encouraged Netanyahu to do that. So there's a range of scenarios, but I think no matter what, in the very initial hours of any kind of strike, I think Israel will first and foremost want to take out as many launchers and ballistic missile capabilities, because that's the main threat to Israel. And so I would imagine that Trump and Netanyahu and the militaries, have a plan for that. And so if Israel is needed for that, it will do that. But obviously the US has many more capabilities than Israel on that level. And so again, it falls on what are the US goals in this, and what kind of, the US and Israel are fully coordinated. So how much is Israel impacting the way that Trump is going to go? But I'm sure in the same way that Kane is providing Trump with all of, the options on the table and what they could lead to, I'm sure Israel is doing the same, providing options, providing intel. And ultimately, Israel will join if the US wants it to join. And then it really depends on, the escalatory level and how bad it gets.
Thanks, Mirav. And Ali, I'll turn to you, and keep sending us your questions, by the way. These are great.
I didn't answer the Hezbollah one, so we can come back to it. And we can come back to it.
No, this is a good a time as any.
So, we heard yesterday that they were evacuating American staff, I think, at the embassy in Beirut. Israel has been talking for weeks now about a bigger operation in Lebanon or South Lebanon. And there's also been talk and rumors about a possible Israeli strike in Lebanon to kick off something else. I don't think that's necessarily the case. There's Hezbollah still has a lot of capabilities, but since the November 24 ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, Israel has been the one to unilaterally act, has complete freedom of action. And there is the threat that Hezbollah and the Houthis will fire. I think the Houthis will probably fire in a situation in which US is going all out on Iran. It's hard to know with Hezbollah, because the minute it enters, it risks a lot more decimation that it already has suffered, and the decimation has been bad enough, and Nasrallah's decapitation was bad enough that Hezbollah has been effectively neutralized since then. And so in that sense, it's a very big Israeli success. But if Hezbollah and the Houthis and Iran are all firing at the same time, then that's a big situation for Israel. I think the kind of threats that we're hearing from the Israeli side, and the supposed evacuation of embassies, is a way for Israel to kind of nod to Hezbollah and say, don't enter this. If you enter this, it'll be bad. So I think they're basically just trying to threaten Hezbollah not to enter. There's something else I wanted to say. I forgot. Yeah, I think that, come back to me if I remember.
Thanks. Ali, coming to you. So the Iranians have gone through one 12-day war already in the past 8 months. They now face a potentially much more significant conflict. And in June, we saw both a degree of, you referred to the victory narrative in Iran as, we're still standing essentially after all of this, and that it was the Americans and the Israelis who agreed to a ceasefire because in the Iranian narrative, their ability to carry on an attritional conflict was stronger than the US or Israeli willingness to engage in a prolonged, open-ended engagement. We also saw a lot of Iranian vulnerabilities in June, right? Air defenses were largely ineffectual. In terms of intelligence, the Israelis were able to, within the first minutes of their operations, take out both senior Iranian commanders and senior Iranian nuclear scientists. So if the Iranians are coming at it from the position that you and Nate both referred to a bloody nose response, what's your sense both of Iran's, how much have they been able to recover those vulnerabilities that were on display in June? And what would be their retaliatory capabilities now? And then there's a couple of questions from the chat that I'll embellish once we get your opening take on that.
Yeah, so several things. Obviously, the element of surprise is gone. So they have been preparing for this moment ever since the 12-day war stopped. How much they have managed to recover, I think, is anybody's guess. How much they have managed to close some of the security loopholes that the system suffered from seriously during the 12-day war, again, anybody's guess. But as I said, the most important thing is the lesson that they have learned, which is to go big or to go home. It's also based on the experience of Hezbollah after October 7th, that you very quickly would face this dilemma of use your capabilities or you will lose them. Right? And if indeed the US wants to, for force protection or for protecting Israel, and this is why, going back to Rob's question, I don't really see an option for a limited military intervention, because I do believe that the US understands that Iran's calculus has changed and it wants to spill American blood. It wants to inflict harm on Israel. And by the way, the Iranians don't make any distinction between Israel and the US here. And so I do believe that their retaliation would probably target Israel as well and drag Israel into this conflict. And so being aware of the Iranian calculation is the reason that if the US wants to do something, it has to tackle Iranian retaliatory capability. That means that it has to go after radar systems, air defenses, and then after missiles and launchers. A lot of these are in bunker facilities. A lot of these are under and very close to civilian centers. So this is why the president, in his Truth Social post yesterday, said this is going to be bad for Iran and also for its people, right? Because there will be a lot of casualties and fatalities on the Iranian side. And this is also why I said this is a regime that has become suicidal, because it is aware of the massive imbalance technologically and in terms of conventional weapons. But it has reached a conclusion that it has no other choice other than going all out. And it would be, by the way, part and parcel and in line with other miscalculations that Iran has committed ever since October 7th and has resulted in all the setbacks that it has suffered. So I do believe that we have to take the risk of recklessness here quite seriously. Now, there are two more things I would add. One is the imbalance and the asymmetry that exists in terms of pain threshold. The Iranians can portray a war in which they lost 1,000 Iranians as a victory. There is no scenario in which a president of the United States can sell a war in which 1,000 Americans are killed as a victory, right? So there is a difference in asymmetry in pain threshold, and the Iranians are aware of that. Second, there is a difference in how both sides can escalate. Of course, the US has vertical escalation domination. It can go after the leadership. It can go after command and control. It can flatten cities. It can destroy infrastructure. There is no limit to how far the US can go with vertical escalation. but the Iranians can escalate horizontally. They can turn this into a regional conflagration. The fact that for the first time in all these years, the Supreme Leader himself comes out and says that there will be a regional conflagration, I think is telling, and it kind of connects to the experience that the remnants of the Axis of Resistance have also had since October 7th. They all chose to fight Israel on their own, and it made it so much easier for Israel to pick them individually. This time around, understanding that Iran is facing an existential threat, if the mothership goes down, they will go after Hezbollah anyways. They will go after the Houthis anyways, right? So even some of the Iraqi groups who were silent during the 12-day war and the tit for tats between Iran and Israel in 2024 might come to the same conclusion, that they would be stuck between a hostile Syria and a potentially hostile Iran. And that poses an existential threat to them. So this is why the risks in this conflict are very, very high. And all of that could have been justified if the objectives were clear and achievable. The problem is that they're not.
Thanks, Ali. I'm going to tack on two questions from our audience that pick up on some of these points, and then I've got a couple of questions that I think could be directed to Nate and you as well. One of the questions is, can you elaborate a bit on what would be the end game for the Iranian government as an outcome of a showdown? I think you may have hinted at it. Is it, we've seen that some of the reporting on the US side is that the outcome of a theoretical limited strike is to strike a better bargaining position. Do you think that that is the Iranian objective, or would a strike basically just be a battle for survival at that point? And the other one to tack on there, so there was the end game question and the likelihood of regime survival after potential military action. Obviously, that would probably be contingent on what sort of action it involves, but let's say for the sake of argument here that the US is going for regime leadership targets as part of it. Does a regime absent its leadership survive?
So very quickly, I know we only have another 6 minutes left. Look, on what the regime wants, I think primarily survival, for sure. It's really without precedent that with the sole use of air power, you can get rid of regimes without any kind of boots on the ground. This can explain why the Iranians are less risk averse than was the case in the past, because they know at the end, even if the regime is transformed or significantly even more weakened, again, for them, the bar is low, is survival, is victory, even if it's a Pyrrhic one. But they have a mirror image of what you see in Washington, in which there's always this argument that a little bit more sanctions, a little bit tougher enforcement, a little bit more military pressure, a little bit, a more bloodier nose will eventually get us what we want. The Iranians also believe that once Trump concludes that he has tried everything, pressure, military pressure, economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, and nothing has worked, he would soften his position or will give in and give up. I think both sides have proven to be wrong so far, and this has created this dangerous stalemate that we're in. And again, in case of political decapitation, one has to remember this is a regime that is very deeply entrenched and also deeply benched, right? As we saw this during the 12-day war, all the commanders who were killed were relatively quickly replaced, and Iran started punching back. So that's not something that one can count on, that with removal of one or two layers of this regime, that you would end up with regime change. You will certainly end up with regime transformation. And we don't know if that would turn into a more pragmatic regime or more radicalized.
Can I just add one point on this? I mean, 70% of Americans are opposed to like intervention in Iran, right? And so the president's gamble here is that, he can get out of this with no cost. So I do agree with Ollie that from the Iranian perspective, they can change Trump's calculus. This is, huge. I don't know whether the risk, of course, is exactly as Ali said, is that this just spirals into a bigger and messier conflict, and maybe Trump does, harden his position and go closer to all in. But it is a big gamble for the president to be executing this arbitrary war where Iran really has virtually no other options at this point than to escalate.
And for more on that, you can check out Nate's just up piece in Foreign Affairs called "Why Iran Will Escalate: U.S. Military Strikes and the Risks of Quagmire." And Nate, we have a question from the press that kind of, I think, picks up on that point. What should the U.S. public expect of a potential conflict with Iran, and how significant may it be that there has been limited explanation of objectives and potential sacrifices to Congress and country?
I think there is the Washington Post had a great piece on this the other day, right? I mean, I think there is kind of widespread understanding that this conflict doesn't make sense, but there is probably, widespread overconfidence, not just in the White House, but also in Congress, also maybe elsewhere, that like the president can get out of this easily just because Iran's so weak, right? So I think this is the misperception that is risky across the board, is that we could potentially walk it into a quagmire, as apparently my piece says. Didn't pick the title, a little stronger than I would have gone with, but okay. But we're potentially walking into a quagmire without our eyes open. And so I just think that is potentially a very bad formula.
Thank you, Nate. And we've got about a minute, so I'll let, I think probably either Ali or Nate take on a question about the role of China. There are rumors that China has been supplying or is about to sell Iran advanced weaponry. Ali, you mentioned Chinese support for Iran, especially through the shipment of sodium percolate for developing ballistic missiles. Anything that you want to sum up in the scope of a minute on how China could respond or what impact this could have for their interests?
Look, China might provide Iran with the kind of military support that would allow it to deliver more effective punches against the United States, but not now. It will be down the road, and down the road might be too late for the Iranians. And both China and Russia have provided Iran with some help, but not sufficient to in any way change the balance of power. And at the end of the day, if war breaks out, I think they're not going to do more than sending their thoughts and prayers.
All right, thoughts and prayers it is. We are at time, so thank you to Nate, Ali, Meirav. That was a great conversation. Thank you to our guests for attending. Thank you to those of you who sent questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get through all of them. If you'd like to relive the adventure, the recording of this event will be available soon on our YouTube channel. And let's see how things stand in a couple of days. So thanks everyone for joining us, and take care.